Progressive. Adjective. Improving or developing gradually or in stages. Progressive rock was a mid-60s to early 70s music movement, an outgrowth of psychedelic bands who abandoned standard pop traditions in favor of instrumentation and compositional techniques more frequently associated with jazz, folk, or classical music. Based on fusions of styles, approaches, and genres, involving a continuous move between formalism and eclecticism, it was often criticized as pretentious and pompous. If anime were categorized like music genres, the 2000 OVA Fooly Cooly would most definitely be considered prog rock, an eccentric and energetic departure from anime standards. Director Kazuya Tsurumaki himself stated that he was trying to break the rules of anime with FLCL, from the contemporary soundtrack to the experimental and innovative animation techniques to the cerebral and subtle storytelling. It was a passionate staff of relative newcomers forging a short and densely packed narrative with as much life and character as possible. So here comes Fooly Cooly Progressive, 18 years after the original show. A color-by-number rehash of the source material with a lifeless presentation, shallow, unlikable characters, and a severe lack of creativity or innovation. So, which show deserves the title of Progressive? The influential, erratic, undulating, and provocative original, or the stagnant, rote, and unappealing cash grab? Disclaimer! I'm a filthy man-child fanboy with an unhealthy obsession and bias towards the original Fooly Cooly, who came into Progressive with every intent to hate and nitpick it because it didn't live up to my unreasonable expectations! Correction! I'm just a passionate fan who came into Progressive with hesitant optimism. I tempered my expectations and feel knowledgeable enough to express my frustrations constructively. I'm disappointed only because I know they could have done so much better. Thank you. For simplicity's sake, I don't want to have to keep saying Fooly Cooly or FLCL, so I'll be referring to this as Progressive and the original as, 1 Prime? Okay, how about we stick with the music genres and call it FLCL Classic? So I actually like this intro. It's much more abstract and oppressive than Classic, but hits a lot of the same beats and does a good job hyping up the fans for this new incarnation. We're introduced to Hidomi, a slightly older female protagonist, who says the classic line about how nothing amazing has ever happened here. While Naota often lamented not having enough excitement in his life and longing to grow up and leave like his older brother, Hidomi has no discernible goal other than just to rot away. Later in that episode, Jinya remarks that Hidomi's reclusive, silent personality is sort of a crutch or coping mechanism. This theme has a lot of merit and potential to explore teen depression just like Mamimi's arc in Classic, but too bad Progressive only uses this theme as a visual motif. The dream sequence continues with an army of medical mechanica irons combing the landscape, and Hidomi proceeds to overflow and summon a new Kanti-esque robotic suit and send one of the irons flying. Thank You My Twilight by The Pillows really captures the inspirational and epic feeling of Classic, but with a catchy electronic hook. It doesn't sound wildly different than Classic soundtrack, but I enjoyed it. And the way the scene climaxes and then sharply transitions to Hidomi's phone alarm was brilliant. Later at school, the conversation between Ide, Mori, and Marco is the best scene of dialogue in the whole season. We see Ide's perspective as he cryptically brags about his intimate encounter with their class's teacher. It feels very reminiscent of Naota's school buddies always gossiping about rumors and getting all riled up about perverted topics, just like real middle school boys. The conversation feels natural while clearly establishing the boys' dynamic and personalities. Ide is cocky and boastful, but wears a sharp-looking school uniform, has glasses, and a short haircut, which seems to allude to him being the brains of the group. Marco dresses very casually, is easily flustered, and has an almost effeminate personality. And the back and forth between Ide and Mori about his progressive fashion choices was genuinely funny and established Mori as this boisterous counterculture nerd. I was excited to see how these characters would grow and what parts they would play in the grand narrative. Unfortunately, much like Naota's friends, with the exception of Ide, they all get the proverbial side character shaft. And that's it! We're 7.5 minutes into the very first episode, and the show's already peaked on interesting imagery and characterization. Obviously, things get better by episode 5, but here marks the downward spiral of quality that was truly mind-boggling. I've never seen such a sharp juxtaposition of the best scene of a show smack dab next to the worst scene of the show. Because immediately after this wonderfully juvenile and innocent exchange, the teacher, whom is obviously Haruko in disguise, wanders in, has this weird, rambly monologue, and then forces the students to watch pornography on her laptop in full view of their classmates. this is the most baffling creative decision I could have ever imagined for this character. Now, Classic established that Haruko is an intergalactic alien who wants to utilize the power of the NO, a portal in the mind through which she can pull objects out in hopes of reuniting with the Pirate King Adamisk. All kind of superfluous knowledge to the story, but point being, Haruko often uses her sexuality since the NO is more potent when the subject is experiencing a heightened emotional state or arousal. So, in the years since Classic took place, Haruko has seemingly ditched the intimate and secretive method of locating potential NO subjects, which we can assume is what happened to Ide here, in favor of an assembly method of mass arousal in the most blatant way possible. The only thing worse would have been for her to literally strip down and molest a bunch of middle schoolers. I get it. Haha, isn't Haruko so crazy? What a deviant. How cringy. But it feels like the writers were only given a vague list and some concept art of Fooly Cooly Classic and asked to replicate it with a new cast. Alright, we got medical mechanical irons, cool robots, teen angst, Haruko, robot fight, guitar weapons, Vespa, and lots of sexual innuendos and phallic imagery. Classic is such a convincing world with realized characters because it utilized subtlety. In Progressive, it's pronounced SUBTLETY! Okay, there's some not-so-subtle stuff in Classic as well, but the titillation served a narrative purpose for the characters. Progressive's fan service is transparent and blatant, and its storytelling lacks depth or nuance. Now, I never expected Progressive to be as good as Classic. I don't even want to compare the two, because I wanted Progressive to stand on its own. It was neither produced by Gainax nor involves any of Classic's influential creative staff. But if it insists on using the same iconography and plot structure, then it's literally a worse copy in every conceivable way. It seems like there's no passion in this production, no energy, a complete waste and totally unnecessary. Why was this show even made in the first place? Oh, right. It feels like the complaints about recent Star Wars films. Just crib all the visuals and retell the same conflict and the fans will eat it up. People like lightsabers, I mean guitars. Everyone gets a guitar! Haruko isn't a character in Progressive, she's a cameo. And that's you, the slobbering masses who will eat up whatever slop we feed you because it's your precious Fooly Cooly. So, here's why Progressive doesn't work. Let's dig a little deeper into these characters, shall we? First of all, their designs are all over the place and clash with one another. Ide, Mori, and Marco look like they could be from completely different shows. Characters can be visually distinct while still feeling cohesive. I'll admit this may be a matter of taste, but I had a hard time believing all these characters weren't just stock anime characters ripped from other media. Aiko, for instance, looks like a knockoff Vocaloid, and Jinyu looks like a randomized custom fighting game character. Designs aside, do any of these characters stand out in any significant way? Aside from Haruko, Hidomi, and Ide, not a single side character has any noticeable growth or significant effect on the story. We'll get into the story later, but the quote-unquote plot of FLCL Classic wasn't all that important. We care about the fate of the world because we have people who we care about and whose stakes in the conflict matter to us. In Progressive, I just can't get myself to care about any of these cardboard cutouts. A prime example is in episode 2. So we've been introduced to Ide as this peacocking schmoozer who thinks he's more of a ladies' man than he really is. That's his character, and I thought he gave a convincing and likable performance. Apparently, the studio must have been worried that no one would like a showboating, potentially misogynist teenage boy in 2018. So to humanize and make him more sympathetic, just give him a cartoonishly ham-fisted backstory about being, like, a slave in a Mad Max apocalypse on the other side of town. Make him so poor and beat down by everyone around him that we can't possibly have any reason to dislike him. He's a victim after all. What a load of hot garbage. They honestly expect me to buy in that Ide, this well-mannered, charismatic kid, gets whipped and beaten by thugs on a daily basis? Is this supposed to be some overblown satire or meta-commentary? 'Cause they play it pretty straight. Similarly, we're supposed to be invested in Hidomi's struggle because her dad left her and her mom and she has unresolved feelings about it. So that's excuse enough to make her this non-character with no goals or agency in her own life. Naoto was cynical but relatable. Hidomi is just a shut-off caricature. So Naoto missed his brother and had a dysfunctional single-parent home, but he was still a character with needs and a desire to grow. Hidomi even has a supportive and funny, if not a little embarrassing mother, but still harbors all this pent-up angst for no good reason. The show puts in a half-hearted attempt to flesh out the supporting characters, but it never strays too far from Ide and Hidomi's conflict and feels like a wasted effort when they could have made the narrative more coherent. Remember how each episode of Classic had a self-contained and satisfying vignette? They had character arcs and focused on interpersonal relationships, which each explored facets of the main theme. Overcoming grief, sexual urges, repression, while also slowly building the underground conflict around those more relatable conflicts. The robot fights were quick and dirty action to emphasize each arc's completion while building towards the finale. Again, we cared about the big Atomist fight and all the crazy destruction because we cared about the characters and wanted to see them succeed. Progressive skips any pretense of character growth to dive straight into the sci-fi conflict, but still retains the cryptic setup of the original. So we don't care about the cast, and we don't understand the conflict. On the surface, Progressive feels like a reimagining of Classic. Haruko shows up to take advantage of sexually curious adolescents to fulfill her goal of freeing the Pirate King Atomisk from the clutches of Medical Mechanica. They're this mysterious corporation that seems bent on smoothing out the ridges of humanity and making everyone complacent drones or something. The NO is a form of teleportation that's linked to the mind, which Haruko uses to try and smuggle Atomisk and any other robots of use out of Medical Mechanica's facilities. Teenagers on the fence between childhood and adulthood seem to be the best candidates for the NO, which can also be harnessed as energy now by the Resistance. Again, none of this really mattered or was very interesting in Classic. It was there and fairly unobtrusive, but allowed for crazy robots to spring out of characters' minds to accentuate their personal growth and allow for them to sort of face a manifestation of their inner demons. In Progressive, none of the characters change, so there's more of an emphasis on random robot fights, or rather Haruko versus Jinyu fights over and over again. These scenes take up significantly more screen time and don't carry as much weight because contextually they aren't that important or interesting. Instead of the secret government operatives who hounded Haruko in Classic, the resistance against Medical Mechanica is this tiny group of homeless-looking dudes who work out of their crummy apartment. Sure, they inexplicably have access to giant machinery and robots and grunts, but it's mainly these three guys as the face of the whole operation, and they're laughably incapable. This younger guy, who turns out to be the son of Commander Amuro, which is thankfully the only major tie into Classic besides this gratuitous end credit cameo, well, he keeps losing all the important artifacts they have because Aiko keeps stealing them to sell to people as a cover-up for a weird dating service. In the very last episode, they drop that Aiko is actually some sort of slave who ran her dating service to buy her freedom from these punks. Oh, but guess what? She's actually some sort of robotic or synthetic plant hybrid who can broadcast to Kanti's screen and grow into this crazy huge vine. It's like when people watch FLCL Classic for the first time and are like, lol, this show is so random, XD. No, this is random. Classic wasn't memorable because it was random, it had its own sort of coherent logic. And while the larger strokes of the story are up for interpretation, the moment-to-moment action makes sense. What's even more egregious is that all that side lore I've been talking about is completely inconsequential in taking down Medical Mechanica, and all the characters get swept under the rug for the finale. It's already a 6-episode season, do you think it could have added more filler? Like, we've already established Haruko and Jinyu's rivalry, and now the 3rd episode is already this weird beach episode, and we have no reason to believe that the kids would go to the beach alone with their crazy, violent, pervy schoolteacher, let alone with Jinyu. So much time is devoted to setting up Aiko and all this pointless fluff fan service. Why am I even watching this anymore? There's a nice moment in the finale where Thank You My Twilight starts playing to ramp up the energy and act as an effective emotional bookmark on the narrative, but I couldn't help feeling, I don't understand what is going on. I don't care about these characters, and I don't understand. The story hasn't progressed, and the characters haven't progressed. Can we at least get something that looks or sounds different than the original? Well, it certainly doesn't look like Classic. Like I said before, I didn't expect Progressive to look anywhere near as good as Classic, but damn, was I consistently underwhelmed all the same. Going back to Classic still is unlike anything I've ever seen, and only Studio Trigger comes close to matching the same energy and visual panache. Fancy that. Every scene in Progressive is so flat and unexpressive. The colors are bland, and the whole package feels so generic. Progressive loses the bold line art of Classic, and the designs overall are just less appealing. and the directing is static and uninspired. Every episode only has a handful of unique visual gimmicks to meet the quota for it to actually feel like FLCL and not just be another boilerplate action or slice of life show. But if Anime News Network is to be believed, we've got a different director for every episode of this dumb show. That would certainly explain some of the inconsistent tones and visuals. Now, if anyone complains that Progressive or Classic looks bad because the animation style is inconsistent, then they are sorely mistaken. The dream sequences, while usually pretty dull and unimportant, are at least a step in the right direction. I adore all the crazy experimental stuff in Classic. It generates this frantic, unpredictable energy that makes it distinct and memorable. In particular, Episode 5 of Progressive is remarkably better than any episode in the season by virtue of having a much more distinct and appealing hand-drawn style, featuring the most provocative imagery and the most engaging conflict. Why wasn't this the direction for the entire season? Way livelier, the characters finally look congruent and kinda memorable. It's actually comical, inventive, expressive, progressive even. And while the manga scene isn't nearly as good as in Classic, it was a fun nod and I was happy to see it again. I thought, this episode must have been outsourced to like Studio Bones or something. The similarity to Masotan is uncanny, but no, this is directed by Kei Suizama, who's only been a key animator on a smattering of anime episodes over the last few years. He was a key animator on episode 4 of Kill la Kill, which was memorable for its simplistic and comedic style and pacing, but that's about all I could find. Oh yeah, and even within episode 5, there's this one moment where the style switches back to the bland cookie-cutter look, and it's this cheesy drama scene making fun of shitty generic love triangle stories, but it only draws more attention to how uninspired the rest of the show looks. If episode 5 had been more of the same, I probably would have written Progressive off as a wholly uninspired and dull cash grab, but now I have a taste of what it could have been, and it makes me even more pissed with what we got. The robot designs are horrendous blobby messes that can hardly hold a candle to the badass and terrifying designs in Classic. This dumb clamshell looking guy was stupid enough, but then they treat it like content and we're expected to enjoy seeing it turn up in episode 2 having drinks and getting beat up again. None of the robots are well designed, relevant, or memorable, and by the end Haruko and company just slam their way through waves of copy and pasted stills. Even Conti 2.0 feels like a DeviantArt redesign of the original. Weird how only the returning characters have good designs. The animation is stiff and lifeless, and they use an ugly 3D model for the car. The action itself is just floaty and janky. Fights mostly take place flying or falling through the air without any interesting interiors or locations to fight around. In episode 6, the girls keep grabbing at each other over and over again in mid-air without any sense of momentum, and the shot is so zoomed in we have no idea where they are. They might as well be wrestling statically in 0 Gs. Also, since when does Haruko just stand in the air and just swing her guitar around? Like, she is a superhuman cartoon character who can leap infinitely high and dodge bullets and fly on her guitar, but she still needs to run on the ground and follow some of the laws of gravity and inertia. And never before have I been distracted by bad Foley. I don't know how slapdash and cheap this production must have been, but come on guys, how did you mess up the sound of fabric?
Marvelous.
Hey you, quick! We need the sound of shirt fabric! The episode is airing in 10 minutes!
Marvelous.
Even the pillows inclusion feels obligatory at this point. It doesn't even really gel with the aesthetic here, and just makes me wish I was watching Classic instead. And this is the very last line of dialogue in Progressive.
There's nothing I want to be. There's nothing I want to do. And that's probably not the best way to be. But, you know what? It probably doesn't matter.
My theory is that this line sums up the studio's attitude when they produced the show. FLCL Progressive has no direction, doesn't know what it wants to be, and it doesn't strive to be anything or say anything new. It's a shameless repackage and they know it, but it won't matter because people will defend it because it has just enough of the trappings to be considered part of FLCL. The whole thing reeks of a foreign market bankrolling a show no one was passionate about doing, and I won't be the least bit surprised when news comes out that everything was horribly rushed and cheap and the staff was treated poorly. It's a real shame, but thankfully FLCL Classic was not a show that needed a second season to fully be enjoyed or wrap up any cliffhangers. It's just as fun to watch now as it was when I first discovered it nearly a decade ago, and I can easily brush prog under the bed and never think about it again. I get that prog rock, and to an extension the original FLCL, isn't everyone's cup of tea, but you can't deny that it tried something different and pushed the boundaries of its medium. Whether you find it pretentious or awe-inspiring, there was something undeniably new and progressive about it. Prog was about outdoing the perceived genericness of rock at the time, and while it was short-lived, the movement pushed the boundaries and paved the way for new sounds and experimentation. Fooly Cooly Progressive is almost regressive in a way because it cheapens the elements that made the original so strong and fresh. It shirks on developing its characters and focuses on bland, meaningless action, in turn conforming to the modern rut of generic action fluff. A far cry from Suramaki's original vision of breaking the rules of anime. I liked the first episode of FLCL Alternative much more than the first of Progressive, so be sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment if you'd be interested to hear my thoughts on Alternative when it's finished airing. In the meantime, stick around on the channel as I transition back to gaming-related videos or whatever weird idea I come up with next.